Hello, I'm Dr. Patti Peeples, and welcome to the next episode of Patti's People, sponsored by the Evidence Base. Today, our guest is Dr. Skip Olson of Olson Strategies, focusing on strategies and solutions related to evidence and implementation science. Dr. Olson was recently the global head of integrated evidence strategy and innovation at Novartis with a remit to drive better decision-making. He comes from a background in HEOR, where he's led the use of real-world evidence to transform the generation of patient insight and value for money assessment. He earned a Doctor of Science in Biostatistics from Harvard University. Welcome, Skip.
Hi, Patti. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to a very interesting and lively discussion.
Same here. Well, let's jump to it. Skip, you've recently published and spoken extensively on the improved discovery of pharmaceuticals and practice transformation to facilitate better, faster science in drug development. Tell me, we have had this conversation for decades about how to better develop drugs. What is different about how you're viewing the problem, and what is unique about some of your proposals?
So, Patti, you're certainly right about this is not a new issue. It's not a new dilemma. It's not a new question. We've asked ourselves the same question, like you say, for decades. We always hear a slightly new twist on things. But what I would say is we also come to a roadblock where we don't really come up with a good answer. And this is where I think, okay, we've come up with something new. One of the things that's really nice about it is when I explain it to people and show it to them visually, they think, oh, yeah, of course, sure. It's sort of a no-brainer. And then I think, okay, if it's a no-brainer, then it should stick. So what's unique about it is it's a way of putting value on evidence. And this has been a question that's been around for a long time. But people say, okay, let me count the number of publications. Let me count the number of conferences that I've been to where we've spoken about certain results. And okay, it's measuring that you're doing something, but is it really measuring that you're having an impact? So what we laid out is we laid out certain value levers. And these levers look at things like, okay, what is it we really want to do? Do we want to increase the probability of success of our development program? Do we want to reach the market earlier by speeding things up? Do we want to increase the slope of our uptake? Do we want to reach a higher peak sales? Do we want to extend our loss of exclusivity? If we do any of these things, then what we're doing is we're increasing the number of patients that we're reaching. Or you can flip it around, you can look at it in other ways using different metrics according to who is looking at this. So it can easily be translated also into the expected net present value or return on investment if you need to have those sorts of discussions. So it focuses on things that really make a difference. And these are real levers where you can say, okay, if I do this particular study or produce this particular evidence, this is what it will do on the speed of the uptake, because it will do this to influence prescribers, because it will do this to get onto the formulary quicker. I'm saying we're going to reach our peak sales not in 5 years, but in 4.5 years. So now I've gotten to my peak sales a half a year earlier. I can measure that. And this will come down into the number of patients reached, or likewise in the financial terms, expected net present value or return on investment. And the way of looking at this forces us to concentrate on what's the impact that it's going to have, rather than I had 10 publications last year, or I had 12 abstracts at conferences, which are nice but not necessarily doing anything.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems like it requires a comparator. If I pursue it this way, your suggestion, mash this lever down so that I can get to market sooner. How does one really study whether or not the implementation science worked if you don't have a comparator? Being that this way is that way.
Exactly. So what we've done is we've normally worked with base case, which is sort of without the added additional evidence, versus the enhanced integrated evidence plan, which is then with the extra piece of evidence, or could be a package of evidence or what have you. So this is the comparator is sort of without and with. And that's an easy way to say, okay, only with this particular evidence will we be able to reach the goal, whatever it is, or reach some kind of target. But it focuses everyone to think about really the impact and not just the count, not the volume, but sort of the quality through the impact that it's having.
Mm-hmm. Will this initially add more money to the drug development process?
Absolutely. And this is one of the things where people aren't quite used to thinking about it this way. To produce evidence, of course, it's going to cost extra money. That gets calculated into things like return on investment or ENPV to look at whether the long-term benefit is going to offset, and by quite a factor, the initial additional investment that's needed.
What I hear you saying, I think, is that we're proposing new KPIs. Can you clarify and specify the specific KPIs that one could be looking at that are different than the number of publications and conferences? You've alluded to them in a general sense, but if one were actually putting KPIs on a dashboard, what would those be?
So, I mean, the KPIs would be exactly the ones that I just mentioned. We would be looking at the number of patients we're actually reaching. We would be looking at what is the return on investment and what is the associated ENPV to look at, okay, if we make this investment upfront, will the payoff be there to offset that? And to come up with the evidence that's really needed, what we need is a collective agreement that the evidence will actually have the impact that's needed. So a lot of this comes down to assessing the product forecast or looking into a patient funnel. So, the patient funnel is the easiest way of thinking about this. We start with a patient population, at the top, and then because of underdiagnosis or non-referrals or competition or whatever, the funnel looks like this. We start with a big patient population at the top, and at each level, because of each, I'll just say, event, we lose patients. And these are normally captured in the forecast with assumptions that go around it, with probabilities or rates. And this needs to be looked at by a very cross-functional team of players medical affairs, real-world evidence, health economics, market access, marketing, commercial, the people who put together the forecast, so those kinds of expertise. Also people from clinical development, to look at these assumptions and to say, yeah, okay, if you generate this evidence and disseminate the evidence in this particular way, yes, you will reach the target audience that will actually enable us to change the assumption here from whatever it is, 30% up to 40%. And then we can continue with the assessment of the actual value that this evidence is bringing. But it really needs this cross-functional collaboration in order to have the checks and balances on, well, what value is it really bringing? What kind of impact is it having on the assumptions that we're making anyway? And through this kind of a process, we can then come up with the number of patients that we're reaching. We can look at the return on investment, and we can look at the ENPV. And then we can say, okay, it's certainly worth it. It's going to enable us to reach more patients and also higher return. Therefore, let's do it. What's holding us back?
Common is assessing ROI and ENPV. Is it something that you began to do at Novartis? Is it something that you do for your clients?
So this is certainly something that we started at Novartis. I'm now also doing it for clients. The development world has been doing this for a very long time. Okay, ENPV is the way that finance talks about any of their investments. So certainly from a drug development point of view, looking at the costs of all the big studies and so on, this is what's used. And so this is another reason why this is a very good KPI to use also for other pieces of evidence, because the main, if you like, the most expensive pieces of evidence are subject to this sort of scrutiny and this sort of evaluation anyway. So why not use the same terminology that's used throughout the organization?
What are going to be the expected transformations that if an ENPV was included in the evidence development? Would it, do you think, mean that we develop more blockbuster drugs, or perhaps we would see more acceptance of less than blockbuster drugs?
I don't know that it will lead to more, and I don't know that it will actually lead to a sort of sub-blockbuster drugs. But there will be a change, or there could be a change, okay? And the change could be as follows. And you alluded to it earlier, and I wanted to pick up on it earlier, but I'll pick up on it now. And that is the upfront cost. Okay, in health economics terms, it's the budget impact versus the cost effectiveness. The cost effectiveness, you get your benefit over whatever, 10, 20 lifetime years. But there's that cost benefit part, the budget impact part, that is affecting me now. It's the money that I have to put out now. Okay, and often the way that finance works within a drug company is you're given a certain budget and you're told, deal with it, make the most out of it. And a lot of that is taken out by the whole development plan because those are very expensive studies. And not much is left over for doing other things. And so then the question becomes, okay, you're asking me to set aside, $10 or $20 million for a study that wasn't foreseen, that we don't have the budget for this year. Oh, maybe next year, maybe not. Maybe in 5 years. Oh, let's wait until the product is launched. Then at least we're making an income. Then we can do the study. Okay. And this way of thinking, or this way of acting, ironically, is exactly what pharma asked the payers to do. So for all of the gene therapies that are out there that cost millions per cure, they come up with interesting ways of avoiding or delaying or dealing with the budget impact problem, but they don't follow that sort of advice themselves when it comes to, okay, I need more money for this particular program because I will only be able to unlock the full potential of this product in this disease area if I do certain actions, and I have to do them now. They can't wait, or they could wait until after a launch, but then you're leaving even more money on the table. So they have to be done now. And so this kind of thinking about how can I creatively solve or manage my budget impact issue is one of the reasons why things don't get done, they get delayed, they get deprioritized, because they're not used to thinking about the long-term benefit versus the short-term budget, or deprioritizing other activities from other programs. Okay, so that's what I would actually see as the more likely outcome of this, not what you said about, having more or less blockbusters or whatever, but having like a clear prioritization of potential molecules in the pipeline.
So Skip, could you clarify, is what you're talking about a new way of value assessment, or is it implementation science? What are we calling this new proposal? And help us understand really how we should be talking about this to our peers and within our own companies.
So what I've been talking about so far is really how do we put a value on evidence that we generate? It could be a real-world evidence study. It could be an implementation science activity. So implementation science, I view it as a kind of a tool of evidence that could drive one of the value levers that I alluded to earlier, and to help us reach for particular products, reach more patients, reach a higher ENPV, or good return on investment. But implementation science on its has a little bit of a different, and that focus is, okay, we do a wonderful job in getting our clinical trial results done, published out there. And what happens is there's this feeling within the company, oh, our phase 3 results are so great, the drug will sell itself. And it doesn't. Well, so the question is, so what happened? Why isn't it selling itself? Why aren't people making logical choices based on the evidence that they see? And the problem is, it's not so, the way people make decisions is not always so logical. Okay, take in information, evidence, yes, but a lot of it is sort of gut feeling. Okay, so, and there are also other obstacles along the way that have nothing to do with the evidence that are prohibiting the drug to actually reach the patients. Okay, so in my last editorial in the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research, I had the one on implementation science. We had a case study in there on Entresto. And it's a very easy one to understand and sort of illustrate the point about implementation science. The science, to define it, is sort of a science that takes the outcomes that we see in our research and translates them into sort of actions that make it actually be used in clinical practice. Because otherwise you have these wonderful results and it's not being used. Well, why isn't it being used? The results are there. And this gap is the no-do gap between what we know from the clinical trials and what we're actually doing in practice, which sometimes they don't match. Okay, so this gap in the Entresto case, 20% reduction in mortality and hospitalization. The thought was this drug will sell itself. The results are so great. And then it didn't. Okay, and so retrospectively, as always easier retrospectively, but this was known prospectively. Okay, so this is where it becomes interesting. So what happened? And just a partial listing of what happened. Physicians were uneasy. They didn't know whether it was right or safe or in a patient's best interest. If that heart failure patient was stable, should they switch the patient to Entresto? Because years of practice with heart failure patients was if a patient is stable, don't change anything. And this was something that was known for a long time. I mean, KOLs, physicians, they were quite vocal about this. So it was known that there was a lingering question. But 20% is 20%, and people should have been very logical in their thinking. But there were these other hurdles. So a study could have been done before launch to look into this. So this is one area of, a hurdle, a barrier that's in the way, that's not really to do with the efficacy or the safety of the product, or perhaps the safety. But another was cardiologists were reluctant to prescribe anything new because they felt that the drugs they had been using for years were sufficient. Now, if you come out with new information, new evidence, you should change. And they're thinking, well, actually, I'm happy. I know how to treat patients. I know how to care for patients using these products. I'm going to stick with them. How do you change that mentality? Okay, now this has really nothing to do with the drug itself. This is a mindset shift. How do you go about changing mindset? This is where implementation science really comes into play, because it's sort of based on behavioral science, and it looks into what are the kinds of things that you can do in order to change mindsets. And this is a barrier. It was a known barrier. Again, these are things that were known early on in the development of the product that could have been acted on early in the life cycle. And therefore, they would have been better prepared launch game, such that the uptake would have been much quicker. And as well, they would have reached a much higher peak sales. The graph that I used, Forbes had predicted that Entresto would be a multi-blockbuster drug. The first few years, the sales in the US are under sort of 100 million, all from being a blockbuster. In the meantime, the drug is now a multi-blockbuster drug, but it never came close to the potential that Forbes had predicted based on what the drug was going to do and how it should have come into practice. So the thought process is, these are the barriers that existed in this particular disease area in rolling out a new product. These barriers were known in advance. They could have been acted upon. They weren't. Therefore, money was left on the table. The question is, okay, how much? You could make assumptions and calculate. It's not going to bring you all the way up to the 4 predicted, I'm sure, but it would have gotten you at least partway there. You would have been leaving less money on the table. It would have been very attractive. But who's going to do it? Where is the budget coming from? Who's responsible for this kind of activity that doesn't fall into clinical development remit, doesn't fall into HEOR or market access or in medical affairs? So these are some of the challenges that an organization faces when thinking about these kind of broader issues, like these implementation barriers. So it's of great interest to a pharma company, but it's looking into issues, if they're acted upon, will be leaving much less money on the table, but they're not used to doing that. Mm-hmm. They're used to getting it onto the market and letting other forces deal with it and not fully taking responsibility for, if I want to reach patients, I need to do my part in attempting to break down these barriers.
How do you change the minds and the operations within a pharmaceutical company so that this sort of thinking is more common?
So a grassroots effort is always nice, but it's also much more helpful if the sort of the senior management is like-minded and gets it and sees it. And like I said, looking at a couple of the graphs that I've had in these last couple of editorials, both on the value of evidence and implementation science in the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research, there are a couple of graphs there that, if anyone looks at them, it's so obvious. It's sort of a no-brainer. Why aren't we doing this? Okay, and if someone latches on to, hey, look, it's this easy, let's do it, it will get done. There are issues along the way, like I mentioned about, the budget and the responsibility and so on, but it can be done.
Skip, you've talked a little bit about a variety of new terms, or terms that are not in our common vernacular, like implementation science, ENPV, or the ROI of the evidence. What other new terminology should we get comfortable with?
So those are some of the big terms that are kind of new, are not new necessarily. ENPV, ROI, they also have been around for a long time. But not many people know much about that, except for people in finance. Okay, and now the challenge is more, how do we get these terms that exist into people's everyday set of active vocabulary, rather than some passive data and they all have heard it once upon a time. And to take an active role into thinking about what are the implications here, because I even remember years ago when confronted with a forecast, my thought was, well, what does this have to do with me? This is all about marketing and sales, and I'm not in that function, so I don't really care. And now I'm telling people, oh no, you should, in fact, take an interest. You should know how this feeds into things like ENPV, return on investment, because they're things that are going to tell you something about whether what you are doing, what you are responsible for, and that's evidence, is actually having an impact or not. Okay, so it's sort of, we need to start using and getting familiar with these terms. Implementation science, though, that's new. The concept is easy to understand. There are barriers that are in the way in a healthcare system. It might be that, in order to use this product, a certain test has to be done. Well, who's going to order the test? Who's going to get paid for the test? And a barrier could be that no one orders it, no one pays for the test, therefore it doesn't get done. And because the test doesn't get done, the drug doesn't get prescribed. Okay, it has nothing to do with the product, but it's the barrier in the healthcare system that's there. And so we need to understand that these are barriers that are there, and we have to do something about it. Now, whether we do some, fancy hybrid type 1, 2, or 3 implementation study to look into this, or whether we do a qualitative study to look into the root cause and then, come up with a solution that we think is reasonable, doesn't really matter as much as just being aware that these barriers exist, and the knowledge that if we do something about these barriers, it's going to have an impact on ENPV, and we could have a very high return on investment. So it's this interplay of some new concepts, some old concepts, but everyone has to get used to them and be comfortable with them.
Are there organizations or groups of individuals that are leading this charge beyond you? Where can our researchers look to level up their skills and being able to get comfortable with relating the work they do with the end sales and results of a product for the pharmaceutical company?
So, yeah, I mean, that part of it is actually lacking a bit. So what I was doing, research for this, I heard for the editorial, there were certain publications that started down the path, but then they stopped short. So, I mean, some of the big leaders in consulting to the pharma industry started, but then it didn't come down to actually linking it to the financial terms that are used throughout the organization. So from the value of evidence, there's not an awful lot that really covers the sort of the projected impact and the implications of that. Implementation science, on the other hand, there's lots and lots of literature out there. All you have to do is put a search implementation science, and you will come up with journals that are dedicated to the topic. You will come up with YouTube videos explaining what it's all about and so on. It's used more in the public health sector from the academic viewpoint rather than from pharma. There are certain CROs that are actively making noise about and supporting implementation science activities. So for that, topic, there are certainly resources that are out there.
Let's dive into a slightly different topic. There has been some recent publications and conversation from major associations questioning or evaluating the value of HEOR. And it makes one wonder if the value of HEOR is diminishing. I have personally postulated that should we continue along the path that we are currently on with such a deep focus on methodology and modeling, that our HEOR field may, in 10, 15 years, end up just as a glorified modeling department, because the data is then translated, sent over the fence to market access, and they are the ones closest to the customer. Tell me a little bit about what's in your mind and on your crystal ball in terms of HEOR's values and what we as an industry can do to ensure that we remain relevant and deeply connected to the customer?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. It's a loaded question. But anyway, let me start with a recent trend to separate HE from OR. So I've seen this at a few companies where OR or most of OR goes to real-world evidence / medical affairs. Okay, and a lot of this has to do with governance, whether that's really a perceived issue or a real issue, it doesn't matter, it's being done. So what's left, if that goes, is health economics. Okay, and there are several, activities that will still need to get done. But let's just take two big ones, modeling and some kind of activity like a network meta-analysis to do indirect treatment comparisons, which is needed to go into the economic model anyway. What I see coming in the future, the near future, so you said something about 10 years, by 10 years time, I would expect that someone can sit down at their computer to chat whatever and type in, I need an economic model in this disease area with a product with these kinds of characteristics and blah, blah, blah. And, perform for me the network meta-analysis to populate all the parameters that you need and get all the costs from each of the countries, the various databases on what the cost will be, et cetera, and so forth. Hit return, and within 2 minutes, you'll have what you need. Okay, you can even ask it to run the various scenarios that you'll need. And you can ask it to do tables and graphs and write the text as well. So I would assume that, what is now taking months or even years can be dramatically reduced. Now, whether you can really just sit down and type it in remains to be seen, but, certainly steps are being made in that direction. So if that happens, and it's going in that direction, but if that really happens, where you can really sit down and type it in and get the answer in 2 minutes, what is the future of health economics? Okay, what is the need? Currently we see things like, HE&OR thinks that what they're doing is strategic. Their peers look at the choice between whether to use a Markov model or whether to use any other type of economic model. They see that as technical and having nothing to do with strategy. Okay, so, and the ones in HE&OR who are good at strategy or in communication, and especially in communicating very, very technical details to a larger audience, they're promoted up and out of HE&OR, usually to access, because there are no sort of, ladder of promotion within HE&OR. So I see a lot of things that are culminating towards having a sort of a health economist, yes, but one for the entire company, or having it sort of outsourced to an operations center, which will do this kind of work because they do it all the time. But you need someone within the company who can still review it and say, oh, this is crap, or oh, this is really very good. So I think that HE&OR as a field really needs to think twice about what is the future, what are they bringing to the table, is it strategic, is it operational? And there's nothing wrong with being operational, okay? But you can't say, oh, we're very strategic, when everyone else says, no, you're not strategic, you're operational. If they're operational, then they have to be good at being operational and make sure that they are the most efficient and the best, and they've thought through every possibility and so on. It's going to be a change, and how much of a change we're yet to see. But with the advance that AI is making, change could be drastic.
So if we loop back to the beginning of our conversation on the value of value assessment, is that the strategic component that health economists, the HE part of HE&OR, should be implementing that will help them continue to bring value to the organization and ultimately to the patient? Is that the savior?
Yes and no. They're certainly used to doing value assessments of a different nature, but used to doing value assessments. So they're familiar with all of the terminology involved, ENPV, ROI, etc. They know how the company works, which is one of the things that I hear from CROs as being a big detriment for them to be either able to implement value of evidence or implementation science, because the experts that they can find in both of those, they don't have the overall pharma knowledge. So someone in health economics at least typically has that. So this is extremely important. So health economics could do this kind of a value assessment for sure. They need to get looped in and say, I can lead this. Okay. At the moment, with the separation between, if this continues to happen, between HE and OR, I see HE being sort of left out of those particular discussions, and not being able to say, I'm going to take responsibility for this. I'm going to lead this. Certainly they can, and I'm not really advocating that any one particular function takes lead. Okay, it depends on the company. There's no one size fits all. Different cultures, different way of doing things. What I have suggested for implementation science is it needs to start early. You need to do your assessment of, are there barriers in this particular disease area? Ones that are of major importance is that in the funnel approach, will it be like this or will it be like this? Okay, and if it's like this, we have a problem. And to identify those barriers early and to say they're going to be the big problem because we have hardly any patients coming out at the end. What I've suggested is, because of the timing, because of the expertise, is that it's health economics that put together an early value dossier, that they add a new chapter to that early value dossier that's devoted to implementation barriers. And take that first look at what are the barriers, and this goes into the healthcare system. So, a lot similar to what health economics looks at anyway, but some things a little bit different. Using methodologies that health economics uses, but some that they don't use or aren't often, like qualitative assessments, patient interviews, and so on. And for health economics to make this first assessment of, look, we have barriers, and yes, there are going to be big barriers in this space, we need to do something. If they can be the trigger point, then they can certainly be one of the drivers of, okay, let the whole company or the big players rally around, let's do something.
Let's go now to one of our favorite parts, which is the lightning round. If we have this conversation in 10 years, what are we going to be discussing?
Well, what I hope we're going to be discussing is the wake-up call that pharma has had between now and 10 years' time, like has just been recently the AI industry, where DeepSeek has said, look, there are different ways of doing things that are much more efficient. You come to the same answer. And I'm hoping that pharma will also have this wake-up call to say, hey, look, the model that we've been using for years in giving us success is also hindering us from reaching a new level. And I'm hoping that the whole pharma model changes significantly between now and 10 years from now.
What keeps you up at night?
Well, not much keeps me up at night for sure. I sleep very well. My cats wake me up every now and then, but okay. Being blindsided by new things, or not really new things, but policy changes that have a sweeping effect on the way pharma actually operates and does its business, where suddenly through a policy change, the usual way of profitability changes dramatically and overnight. And pharma is so slow at adapting and is not agile. These are the things that I think about a lot.
Well, speaking as an American in January 2025, being blindsided by policy changes, it's what should HEOR be doing more of today?
So more of, I would say, more communication. That's good communication, effective communication. I usually addressing an audience in the language that they understand, and learning to be comfortable with strategic discussions at any level within the organization and even with outside the organization.
What should HE&OR be doing less of?
There's hardly ever a less. It's always more, more, more. But if I would say less of, it's, of course, they have to be expert in the technical parts, but being less obsessed with some of the technical details, which leads them to be perceived by their peers as sort of nerds, technical geeks. Less of that for sure.
How should our university training be modified or improved to address some of these future needs?
So I think, can you have a separate course on effective communication? Yes. Do they highlight the right things? I'm not sure. But certainly effective communication as part of any kind of health economics program, I think would be a definite plus. Strategic thinking also, I don't know how effective these kinds of courses really are, but certainly that is also needed. But I think also effective training on the overall pharma model and how it operates and works, because getting this kind of an insight early into the big picture of how pharma works will make them all that much more effective right from the start when they actually enter the industry.
And what are you most excited about for our industry?
So, I really hate to sort of jump on the bandwagon. And a year ago, I wouldn't have. But now I'm at a point where I think, okay, I see the possibilities. I see what it can do and is already starting to do. And that the use of the strategic use of artificial intelligence, it might make, health economics more operational, like we've alluded to before. But I think also using it in a strategic sense to point out to the rest of the organization, look, these are our weak points, or in this disease area, these are the points that will be issues. These are the weak points. Here are the strengths. These can be teased out by AI sort of in the future, maybe not yet, okay, but in 10 years, these are the kinds of things that I think will be coming. And in always that kind of effort, I find exciting.
Mm-hmm. Well, Skip, I want to thank you for a really illuminating and thought-provoking discussion. I think that your overarching belief system in the strategic value of the work that HE&OR can do to better improve drug development is a pathway that our industry really needs to embrace. So thank you.
Great, and thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss these two topics today. I'm obviously very interested and very passionate about, so thank you.
Yeah. I really look forward to continuing to follow your work and to read your editorials and to see you driving better strategy for our industry. I think it is critically important, and I don't want you to be the only voice. So be an advocate and a proselytizer, so to speak.
Right.